neutral, and done given the rubrics of political science, democracy, and the rules of cabinet formation of government. This book, therefore, gives us an understanding of how power in Goa was acquired, how it was exercised, and the challenges during these 3 decades. If we to seek to understand the foundations of Goa's modern political systems and the ideologies that shaped the state, and which is still shaping the state even as we speak today, then this book is a must-read. For it is not an opinion, not the kind of opinion that one comes across in casual conversations, but it presents facts as well as analysis derived from interpretation of those facts. I am not in the habit of using these terms of in-depth and meticulous while talking about books, because I find that most books merely scratch the surface and leave much to be unearthed by the others who are the readers and elsewhere. But in this case, in the case of this post-colonial politics in Goa, cabinet government, there is every reason to use all these words and more. This is the most detailed book of the period from 1963 to 1994. And having known Freddie for quite a decade or so, I'm not surprised that he really went so much into meticulously researching this subject. The period the book deals with is from 1963 to 94, the first election in 1963 in liberated Goa, and the first election in 1989 after statehood, and that entire term up till 1994. So when we look at it from 1963 to 1990, we had some relatively politically stable years, in the sense that there were no constant changes in government. Governments were not being brought down except for one in 1979. So then history tells us that we had just 3 chief ministers in those years, Dayanand Bandodkar, Sashikala Kakodkar, and Pratap Singh Rane. But then to truly understand the political upheavals of that time, the defections, disagreements between parties and within parties, and sometimes very outspoken views against the party leadership leading to defections, though not bringing down governments, you get an idea on this book. For instance, and I'll just briefly, Bandodkar took office on December 20, 1963. 13 days later, on January 2, 1964, 2 MLAs of the Praja Socialist Party threatened to resign and withdraw support to the government. Incidentally, the assembly was yet to meet. It met on January 9th of 1964. So even before the first assembly could meet, there was already some dissidence, some defection talks. A year later in March, the MGP steering committee, and we have to remember that Bandodkar was the president of the MGP, asked Bandodkar ministry to resign. So you had these disagreements, dissidents happening all through. But the only time it led to a fallen government was in April 1979 when Sashila Kakodkar was defeated and president's rule was imposed. Now that's history that we are all aware of. But here's something to think about. And I would like to quote from the book. It's about 2 paragraphs that I'm going to quote because it is the author's impression, or rather it is the author telling us the different leadership styles between Bandodkar and Kakodkar. I quote from the book. The abyss of difference between Goa's second chief minister Sashikala Kakodkar and her father Dayanand Bandodkar, who was the first chief minister, was the latter's overriding leadership qualities. He had that peculiar ability to make men out of nowhere and the capacity to outwit them with superior strategy when they turned rebels. Bandodkar's acumen at handling ministerial and party crisis and damage limitation was striking, if not proverbial. Those who rebelled against him were literally condemned to political wilderness by the people at the next elections. Sashikala Kakodkar's leadership did not show an ability to decipher the right man from the right job. Her choice of ministers and MLAs proved to be her undoing in the second cabinet, as the men she had chosen to collaborate with deserted her. Coupled with these qualities of Bandodkar which she lacked, populism, mass-based accessibility, perceptible generosity, etc., and the changed political ambitions of her MLAs were other factors that brought the downfall of her ministry. Unquote. Now, dissidence has been the hallmark of Goa's politics. The Pratap Singh Rane government too had its share of dissidence. Now, while Bandodkar and Kakodkar were chief ministers of a regional party and were also the party presidents and had a very iron grip on it. Rane was not so lucky. He came chosen as a consensus candidate for the post of chief minister, and the party organization was always in the hands of somebody else. And he had to, every decision had to be ratified by the high command. But he also utilized this to his advantage, especially to tide over any crisis in the government, leaving the decisions to the party leaders in New Delhi. Now, Freddie mentions this in his book, and I quote, "Even as authority comes with position, and with authority comes power, seen as a capacity to impose one's values and viewpoints on others, Rane chose not to impose his will, despite the fact that dissidence was tarnishing the party image. As leader, he initially chose merely to issue public statements, calling on party men to refrain from dissidence due to accountability to the electorate. But later he rushed to the high command at every crisis to let New Delhi make the decision, which was the best alternative then. Rane was perceived by his critics as ruling by high command fiat, rather than consensus hammered out among his colleagues." Unquote. Now, decisions, rebellions, defections did go on, and we know about it. This dissidence goes on even till this day. Defections also have been going on even in the current term, so it is till this day. But that's not only all about politics. There was also path-breaking legislations that came about. And in the first 2 terms of the Bandodkar ministry, we had the Agricultural Tenancy Act, the Land Revenue Code, the Protection from Eviction of Munkar Act, Agricultural Laborers and Artisans Act, protections of tenants' rights, which were really path-breaking. My intention in listing this is not to tell you what you already know, but to see how the author's view of them in some very brief remarks, because he's really not made a detailed analysis of this because it is not within the scope of the book. But there is one particular paragraph again that I have chosen to read out to you all, and it deals with the Munkar Act. It's to give an understanding of how Goa was kind of aping what the other states were doing. I quote, "The Munkar Act too was modeled on Maharashtra legislation. These imitative legislative measures caused more problems than they solved. For instance, in the case of the Munkar Act, the term Munkar in the Goa Act and tenants in the Maharashtra Act were treated as identical. The failure to differentiate between the Munkar of Goa and the tenant of Maharashtra was a serious shortcoming and did cause needless litigation subsequently. In the long term, however, both the Agriculture Tenancy Act and the Munkar Act proved beneficial to the farmers and tenants, making them owners of their land, but it proved disastrous to the landlords as they lost their lands. It also led to the fall in agricultural production due to fragmentation of land." Unquote. We now come to the decade of the 80s, which brought the Congress in power. This decade was marked by the protracted official language agitation and statehood. Rane helmed the government for the entire decade, and there will be many assessments of his government. They've happened, they're still happening, I guess. Here's what Freddie has to say. "The notable shortcomings of the Rane decade were the failure to correct regional imbalances in development as promised, especially in the old conquests. Failure to tackle the grave and growing menace of unemployment, failure to prevent deforestation indulged into even by ruling MLAs, and failure to set up a power generating station despite growing demand for more power. The Rane ministries could be accused of pursuing lopsided priorities, declaring tourism as an industry instead of agriculture, and indiscriminately allowing the setting up of 5-star hotels, which was a heavy drain on the scarce local resources, especially water. On the whole, the Rane decade witnessed praiseworthy development, but unfortunately, the common man remained disillusioned with the Congress rule, primarily due to the unprecedented price rise, widespread unemployment, and corruption and influx of non-Goans, a consequence of increased development activity in Goa." Now, when you read all this, and the reason I'm reading is to show that it is a kind of a very balanced kind of analysis of those 3 decades of Goa. We are not taking, the author does not take sides with any of the governments or with any of the chief ministers or any of the parties. Now, After this, around this time, it came to statehood. Daman and Diu were no longer appended to Goa. The strength of the Legislative Assembly increased from 30, or rather from 28, because Daman and Diu were two constituencies at that time, to 40. The election results, the first election results were a stalemate. Congress MGP each won 18 seats, and then and there were two independents who sided with either party. And then you had to wait for the by-elections due to the countermanding of elections, which Congress won, and Congress formed the government, but not for long. And then started that long decade of government after government being toppled and a new chief minister being thrown in again of every few months almost. The first fall of the Durrani government in 1990 is described by the author as such. And I'm sure most of you all will agree with this particular analysis, and because it's possibly even happening even till today. I quote, "The craving for power, especially among the newly elected MLAs, was such that they could not hold back their political ambitions. CM Rane's strategy of delayed decision-making and postponing of contentious issues did not pay off in the third Rane ministry." Unquote. So what happened after that is that we had a series of government, there was no stability, and horse trading became rampant, dissidents led to defections to toppling game, and this continued till the end of the term. Now, politics is a subject of interest to everybody. This, therefore, is not the only book on Goan politics that you will find in bookstores. But post-colonial politics in Goa cabinet government is, according to me, a very strong foundation that will give readers an understanding of how Goa transitioned politically from colonial rule to a fully functioning state within the Union of India. In this perspective, the book comes across as a valuable reference to students of political science as well as researchers, journalists, and policymakers. But it is also a worthwhile read for anybody who is interested in Goan history and Goan politics. What makes it easy to read this book is that it's in chronological order. So you will be able to view the shifts as they happen. There's no need to go back and forth and turn the pages. Now, was it easy to leap from a foreign dictatorship to a homegrown democracy? I don't know. 30 years that this book talks about or reviews is not enough time to make a very big educated guess or a conclusion. But Goa definitely embraced democracy and electoral politics. And you can see the evolutions of Goa's political institutions, the early dynamics in the Legislative Assembly that in some areas even still exists today, and especially the interplay between the leaders of the political parties. There are also some surprising snippets of information in the book, and I think Danika took away what I wanted to say over here, but then all of us say that, or rather we all of us, and rightly say that Francis Mount Cruz was the architect of the Nehru Stadium. But then the idea came from whom? I think I will have to name, he's sitting right here, Jovit Lopes. It was his idea. So while reading this book, I also come across something like this which I was not aware of. And so it makes it very interesting for you to read. As I wind up, there is one aspect of this period that has been in my thoughts for a very long time, but it has not been touched upon in this book because he's talking about cabinet government and my thing is more about elections. But I would like to bring it up here and leave it as a thought to this audience over here for a discussion. Manorkar's was the second non-Congress government in the country. A fact that indicates that Goa rode against the political tide in the 1960s and 70s, when all other states were voting for national parties. In the 1980s and thence, Goa turned to the national parties, while in the rest of the country, states started looking at regional parties. They started somewhere in the south. You had MGR in Tamil Nadu, NTR in Andhra Pradesh, and then in the north, the Yadavs breaking up from the Dals and forming their own Dals. And at that time, when everybody was breaking up and looking at regionalism, Goa turned to the national parties. Now, in the beginning, soon after liberation, the assertion of regional identity was very strong in Goa. How did it get watered down in later years? There could be many reasons for this, but I do feel that migration has played a major role here. And I leave this thought in your minds and in the mind of the author also for a deeper discussion at another time, not at this moment. On that note, I congratulate Freddie